Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a discussion between Clements Center Executive Director Will Inboden, who is also the Editor-in-Chief of TNSR, and author and journalist Craig Furman, talking about his book, Author-in-Chief, Untold Story of Our Presidents and the Books They Wrote. As researchers and scholars, we know that we should treat memoirs with a degree of skepticism as they can often be self-motivated. But what can we learn when we examine the books as political statements themselves, as well as pieces of literature and reflections of the priorities and character of those who put their name on them? In this fascinating discussion, Inboden and Furman discuss the relationship between presidents and their ghostwriters, as well as how it is that presidents use these books to advance their political views, their careers, and to reflect their interests, their priorities, and at times to assist in their financial well-being. Let's listen in on this fascinating discussion about presidents, their words, and the words of those who they've authorized to craft their message for them.
Welcome to the latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Our honored guest today is Craig Furman, the author of a fantastic new book called Author-in-Chief, a great riff on Commander-in-Chief, and it's a book about the books that presidents write, American presidents write and have written. I especially encourage our listeners to buy it. It makes for great lockdown reading, and it also makes for great summer reading, and both of those are upon us. So I certainly enjoyed it quite a bit. Craig, let's begin with the beginning. Tell us about how you developed the idea for this book. Where did you get the idea to write this?
Well, believe it or not, it started all the way back in 2008. I was in grad school at that time and, going to grad seminars, reading books, thinking about books, which was great. But there was also this presidential election happening, all around us. And it was really hard not to spend a lot of time that I should have been spending reading Post-Continental Theory, going to Politico's website and clicking refresh, because it was an exciting election. And what really excited me is that it felt like books were right at the center of the election and thus right at the center of American life. I mean, John McCain's books were huge bestsellers and were really important in sort of defining the themes that made him such a powerful candidate. But even more, Barack Obama's books were everywhere, and readers were responding to them, which is just another way to say voters were responding to them. And so I responded to those books as well, too. I thought they were great books, read them, really enjoyed them. But I did find myself curious. Is this the first time this has happened? Are there other examples of where books were central to a political candidate's rise or to an important election? And so the next year I started digging in, and nobody had ever written about this before. So the digging in started out with something as boring as just making a list. How many books did John Quincy Adams actually write? And answering those kinds of questions. And what I realized is that the history of presidents and politicians writing book is essentially American history itself, because the first presidential candidate who had a book sort of interfere and shape their run for the White House was Thomas Jefferson. And the first president who did a presidential memoir to kind of try to process and shape their experiences and try to, explain themselves to history was John Adams. So you go all the way back to the second and the third presidents, and so many of them have written books since. We haven't always done a great job remembering that or sort of recognizing how important these books were. But I quickly realized in the 10 years I spent on this that these books were right at the heart of American history.
So fantastic, and I love that you, in a disciplinary sense, bring the craft and style of a scholar, an English scholar, with the archival work of a historian. So, tell us a little bit more about the research process itself, the archives you visited, maybe some of the interviews you conducted, and how you went about putting this book together.
Sure, there were sort of two tracks in research, but they really reinforced each other. And I think they helped me out a lot, because having a very specific question and a very specific focus of just presidents and their books helped me notice things and notice connections that I think a lot of previous scholars had missed. There's letters from Ronald Reagan in this book that no Reagan biographer had seen before, because I just happened to look at the archive of his ghostwriter, and there were a lot of Reagan letters there that aren't duplicated anywhere else. And so I found new letters from Andrew Jackson, new documents from John F. Kennedy, people you think there's not anything new to find. But again, having this really specific focus helped. So the two tracks I mentioned, I was sort of thinking about, how are books made? How much do books cost? what kind of books are popular, sort of the history of publishing and the book trade, and really the history of readers, because readers have a lot to do with this, just like voters have a lot to do with elections. And then I was thinking about specific presidential biography, who wrote those books and what they learned. And those really weren't separate tracks. They were constantly crossing each other, and sometimes the places that they crossed were the most interesting. I mentioned John Quincy Adams earlier, and as a young man, he's working as a diplomat, he's traveling all over Europe, but he's also writing his father letters saying, if I could really have things my way, what I would do is be a poet, because that's what America needs. Nobody over here is taking America seriously because we don't have any great culture. And I feel like I could be one of the first Americans to do that. Whether it's because of John Quincy Adams' talent or the demands on his time, or, probably a combination of both, he was never able to write the poetry that lived up to that level. It was more people like Washington Irving who came a generation or two after him. But what you see is that this idea of, who should write American poetry, who should write American books, that was an international question. That was as important as having a big military, was showing, that American culture can measure up to the other nations that they're trying to compete with. And so that's just one example. But again and again, whether it was changes in printing technology or the kinds of books that were popular, or the rise of, confessional memoirs with Obama's books, there were so many instances where understanding the literary history helped me notice things that maybe political biographers or historians had missed, because books, for most of America's history, books have been our popular culture. Books have been the things that sold the most and that people read and that people cared about. And so that's just as true for presidents as it is for anyone else. And when you pay attention to those books and try to understand those books in their own time period and context, I just started discovering more and more new and exciting things.
Yeah, no, that's why, it may be said that Americans are a people of the book, right? And so, even going back to our Puritan literary legacy. So now tell us about, there's a number of themes you brought up in there, the international one, the ghostwriters that we're going to come back to, but tell us a little bit more about some of the biggest surprises that you encountered over the course of researching and writing this. And I'm trying to be open-ended about that, but surprises may be presidents who went up quite a bit in your esteem, or maybe went down in your esteem, or just an entirely new dimension of the man that you had never had encountered before.
Sure. I think the kind of big picture surprise for me was just how far back this history went. I think there's a kind of a tendency today to sort of dismiss political books and kind of roll your eyes at it. And I'm not going to lie, a lot of current political books, let's say from the 20th century on, they sometimes deserve those eye rolls. They're not that great. But these books have been so important for so long, and there have been some really good and really important ones that, I found examples of this kind of eye-rolling impulse in the 19th century. There are newspapers who are like, oh, William McKinley, the governor, has a book coming out. Well, I guess he's getting ready to run for president. So this thing, it feels like kind of cool and jaded to be like, oh, somebody's publishing a book. Well, we all know what that's about. It's not about a book being good. It's just about somebody's careerist ambitions. You're a little bit late on that joke if you're making it, because Americans have been making it for more than a century. But that also shows that these books have really mattered and been important, and sometimes can be really revealing, because when you look at somebody as a writer and you see them sit down to write and to think about books or to work with other writers or even as readers, you can see a very human side of them. And I think that gets to the other surprise that really stuck out to me, which is just that Abraham Lincoln wrote a book. If I tell you that Abraham Lincoln was a great writer, that's not a surprise. I think we all understood that he's, in my mind at least, the best writer and the best author that we've ever had as a president. But the fact that a book was so important to him winning the White House was definitely a surprise to me. When I realized that early on in the research, it really stopped me, because I'd read a lot of the big Lincoln biographies, and they don't give much attention to the work that he did to put together a book. But I think it's important for two reasons. The first is that the book was really important when he ran for the White House. But the second is what I was talking about with the human side. The fact that Lincoln, and he really was the first president to be able to see that a book gathering the candidate's own words and presenting those words to voters could be something that would really help. And I think the reason Lincoln was able to see that was just that books mattered to him so much. This is where bringing in a president's biography is helpful, because Lincoln grew up in the frontier of Indiana, where books were rare, but people who were ambitious and intellectual were probably even rarer. And so the fact that Lincoln could find big ideas and big themes and big arguments in these books, it helped him understand why printing was so important. There's kind of this obscure Lincoln lecture that he worked on. He actually worked on it before he ran for president, in the years kind of between when he lost the Senate race to Douglas and when he ran for president. And it's a really fun lecture because it just shows you a surprising side of Lincoln. And he's sort of talking about, well, what technology has been the most important technology for humanity? And so he starts with, iron tools, goes all the way up to the telegraph, talks about, different forms of technology and what they mean. But the most important technology, he said, was printing, because printing was the technology that made all the other technologies easy to disseminate. Because once you could have a book produced on a mass scale, you could take other ideas, or you could take schematics on how to make a telegram, and you could make those available to everybody. The word Lincoln used in the speech was emancipate. He said that printing could emancipate the mind. And in the 1850s, that's not a word you use lightly. That's a word that really shows how important printing was to Lincoln, and tells you something about the human side of him. And so Lincoln worked really hard on this book. It's one of my favorite stories that I tell in the book, and I kind of go really far behind the scenes and track the letters and how hard he worked to assemble this book. But the book gathered the debates between him and Douglas, and it was a huge bestseller. It's crazy to me that it hasn't been a more important part of kind of the discussion around Lincoln. But if you adjust its sales totals to America's population today, it sold more than 500,000 copies, which is a huge number. But it was also discussed by all sorts of journalists. I used a lot of computerized databases to sort of find the journalist discussion of it in the 1850s. It was a book that was everywhere. One newspaper said this book should be in the hands of every reader, and I mean, it really felt like it was. And what it did is it took Lincoln's ideas in his own words and disseminated them. That's what printing can do, right? And so it gave readers and voters everywhere a chance to sort of see Lincoln's take on the big slavery debate. And it was essential to helping him become president, which Lincoln knew. That's why he worked so hard to put the book together himself.
Yeah. And I especially love your reference to Lincoln as just a gifted writer and stylist, because we actually have had some gifted writers in the White House, not all of them, but we've had some. And Lincoln is certainly among the very best there. Back in the day when I worked at the State Department, when I would, and for our Washington listeners, when I would on occasion have writer's block for some sort of policy memo I was working on, I would sometimes take a walk a few blocks over to the Lincoln Memorial and just, stand there and read his second inaugural. As among other things, it's a great political statement. It's a great sermon. Some call it the best sermon in American history, but it's a beautiful piece of writing. And it would, not that my writing would ever even come close to that, but one great drill that I tell my students for improving our writing is read good writing. And that was, Lincoln just had such a gift.
Yeah, there's no question. And he was a big reader too, especially of nonfiction. And he, for him, it was Henry Clay's speeches. He owned 2 volumes of that, and those were, an inspiration to him. So I totally agree.
Yeah. I want to come back in a second to another very significant 19th century president in your book, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. So we're going to get back to that. I want to read a couple of excerpts from the book for that. But before we do, because it's come up a couple times already in passing, some of our more cynical listeners, and yes, listeners, I know there's some cynics among you. I'm with you sometimes. The minute we hear presidential book or presidential writing, we think ghostwriters. It's all ghostwriters. And you actually tackle the ghostwriting question. You don't just tackle it head on in your book. You kind of weave it in throughout. It's one of the themes of your book. Tell us your reflections and observations on ghostwriting, and how should we even think about it and evaluate it as part of this larger question of presidential authorship?
No, I'm glad you brought it up, because it's definitely something that like you said, cynical readers and especially cynical writers, it's especially writers who like to ask this ghostwriting question will bring up. So to me, you have to start with the beginning, which is with George Washington. I mean, if you're somebody who thinks that ghostwritten prose is somehow inferior, or a president who marshals good ghostwriters on his or her side is somehow lacking in judgment, well, example 1A is George Washington. And so the criticism really has to start there. And I think it's important to note that Washington's contemporaries had no problem with this. John Adams, and I mean, the best example, and the example I talk about a lot in my book, is Washington's farewell address. And obviously Madison helped with an early draft, and then Hamilton really did a lot of the work on the second draft. Crucially, Washington was still very involved. Washington, said, these are the ideas. Washington even defined, this is the style that I want the speech to come in. And then, of course, reviewed documents himself. So he set the tone. He picked really good ghostwriters, which is an important step. And he was very involved. But still, other people did a lot of the work to put those ideas in their most eloquent form. And somebody like John Adams was like, well, what's the problem here? Washington never saw himself as a writer. And, if you've got people, if you're friends with Alexander Hamilton, why wouldn't you have Alexander Hamilton, take a run at polishing your phrases? It just makes sense. So I sort of share that history in the book, but also share how it became controversial. And this idea that ghostwriting might be some kind of moral failing or some kind of problem, that started really early too. So after Hamilton died in the duel with Burr famously, and his reputation sort of hit a low point, his wife tried to prove that he had actually written the farewell address, which already in the early 19th century was kind of a national scripture. And so she was trying to prove that, hey, my husband had as much to do with this as George Washington did. He should get some of the credit for that as well. And the story I tell in my book is, it almost feels kind of like a detective story, because you've got this race to find the documents in Hamilton's handwriting that prove it. And you have people who are loyal to Washington, people who are loyal to Hamilton, lawsuits, sort of menacing encounters in people's homes. It's a crazy story to try to prove what this document, who actually wrote this document. But the takeaway, I think, is that once readers sort of realized, well, hey, this is a complicated process. Hey, this is something that, just because somebody doesn't author a speech, that doesn't mean they can't authorize it. Readers came around to it pretty quickly. And so by the middle of the 19th century, it was okay that Washington didn't write every word. It was okay that Andrew Jackson had other aides who would sort of put put speeches into words for him, because what still mattered was the person whose reputation gave those words meaning, and sort of who took the blame or the credit for it either way. So there have been scandals about ghostwriting that pop in and out throughout American history. The one with John F. Kennedy, which we might get to talk about, is certainly a big one as well. But what I found again and again looking at the archives is that regular readers, they didn't really care about it. This idea that ghostwriting was a problem tended to come more from writers and journalists, who are, of course, a little biased on this question about whether writing is the most important thing one can do with one's time or not, than it came from voters or readers. The distinction I decided that was more helpful was not to say, is something ghostwritten or not? Is something good ghostwriting or bad ghostwriting? And you can find both examples from a lot of different presidents. Reagan was somebody who, I think the Reagan chapter in my book has a lot of new information in it. And he wrote a really, really good book early in his political career in the 1960s. And it's a great example of good ghostwriting. It sounds like Reagan. It has a lot of new information about Reagan. It's very smart politically in positioning him to have a kind of broader appeal post-Goldwater. Yeah, it was ghostwritten, but Reagan was very carefully involved with that book and worked hard to make it a good book. The book that he published after he left the White House, not really so good of a book. So, even one president can have an example of good ghostwriting and bad ghostwriting. And I think it makes more sense to evaluate things in those terms than to just say, oh, something's ghostwritten, there's nothing to learn here.
Yeah, no, the very, very important distinction, and we'll come back to that on Kennedy. Just because you mentioned Reagan, I will say, and our listeners are getting used to hearing from me the occasional riffs on Reagan based on my own research and writing. But I do find that in the case of Reagan, it's not always, it can be a false choice between having good speechwriters or being a president who's good with words. In Reagan's case, he had some very gifted speechwriters, Peggy Noonan, Tony Dolan, Peter Robinson, who've gone on to have pretty distinguished careers in their own voice. But especially for Reagan's most notable speeches, the Westminster Address in June of '82, Evil Empire, SDI, others, he would write or rewrite substantial portions of it himself. And it's fun to kind of trace the speechwriting process in the archives and, see sometimes, 50, 60% of the text is in his own hand. And yet there was a real collaborative process with his speechwriters who could channel his voice, and he in turn could, build on their material. So that's a way that it can be done better.
He took pride in it too. I think that's another way to say what you're saying. There's the time for choosing speech, which he did write himself, a little early in his career for him to be having, access to those kinds of ghostwriters. But somebody wrote him a letter afterwards that said, it was a great speech. I don't know if you wrote it. I don't really care, but it was a great speech. So you can see right there that the reader is not obsessed with the ghostwriting question the way others might be. But still, in the margin of that letter, Reagan wrote, I did write it. Because, that mattered to him. He was a writer. He was a reader. Those things mattered to him, even if it didn't necessarily matter to other people. And that sort of pride in authorship is why he cared, and why when he did work with a ghostwriter, he took it seriously and got good results.
Well, that's a good segue into one of my favorite sections of your book, going back to the 19th century, about a president who emphatically did not use a ghostwriter, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. And even though some of this story had been told before, I thought the way you pulled together the themes of Grant's life in these very poignant, tragic, painful final weeks, months of his life, where he had, gone from, considerable wealth to destitute bankruptcy. He was dying of this vicious toxic throat cancer, and he was trying desperately to finish writing his memoirs, partly for history, but especially so his wife would be provided for once he died. And throughout there, and I'm going to read an excerpt briefly here before I want to hear your thoughts. There's a little bit of the theme of Grant being someone who throughout his life had been, as my old boss, George W. Bush, would say, misunderestimated, So I just want to read a brief excerpt from page 152 here. Is Grant's writing this in a note at the end of his life. I never thought of acquiring rank in the profession I was educated for, he wrote in a note to Dr. Douglas, and yet he became a decorated general. Grant continued, I certainly never had either ambition or taste for political life, yet I was twice president of the United States. If anyone had suggested the idea of my becoming an author, as they frequently did, I was not sure whether they were making sport of me or not. I have now written a book. And even just kind of the terseness of that final sentence there, and of course it's just a few days later that he dies. Really, really powerful. And this not only was an American president, but arguably our most important and distinguished Civil War general, at least on the Union side. Tell us a little bit more about what you learned about Grant over the course of this, and what were the secrets, how this man who'd been underestimated so much of his life was able to turn out such a literary masterpiece.
Sure. No, I'm really glad you asked about it. And I'm glad that you read that excerpt because, by that point, that close to the end, Grant couldn't even whisper. So writing in those kinds of notes was the only way he could communicate. And yet you can still find that clarity, that concision, that humanity, which just speaks to what a natural writer he was. This is really an example where it helped to understand the literary context and where I sort of, by understanding that, was able to sort of see new things about Grant that maybe other people had missed. Even in that note, you heard him say, so many people have been asking me to be a writer. And it's important to understand that the Civil War kind of changed the course of autobiography and certainly of political autobiography in America. Because after the war, there was such intense interest. I mean, it was, right now the only topic that anybody cares about is the coronavirus, right? Well, even more intense was the obsession with the Civil War, both during and after it. And so that's all that anybody in America wanted to read about. And up to that point, if you were a political figure like a Benjamin Franklin or a John Adams, and you tried to write your autobiography, you had the assumption that it wouldn't be published until after you were dead. Because if you tried to tell your own story in your own voice and have it published during your lifetime, that was just seen by most Americans as hopelessly vain. Having a ghostwriter, that's not a big deal to Americans. But trying to publish your own book, that crosses the line, because the idea in the 19th century was that people who ran for president or served as president didn't want attention, didn't want too much focus on their own achievements. That could come after they passed away. But the Civil War changed that, through people, especially on the Southern side, and then people like William Sherman on the Northern side. They started to publish their autobiographies. These books were huge sellers. Anytime a book would come out, it would be debated in the newspapers. People who had served in the battle would be like, I was there with Sherman. He gets this right. He gets this wrong. And so it was a huge interest in these stories. And the biggest fish out there was Ulysses S. Grant, because he was the most prominent general, and then he was president, and everybody wanted him to write. And he just really had no interest in doing this. What changed that was his cancer, but even more than that, the financial issues, where he had some bad investments, lost all of his money, and realized that he needed to do something to make money. And so at that point, a magazine editor, somebody who's been forgotten today, but his name was Robert Johnson, sort of convinced Grant, hey, you need to write for this. And Johnson is somebody who doesn't get much attention in Grant's story, because everybody wants to talk about Grant and Mark Twain, which is great. I have a lot about Mark Twain in my book too, and his relationship with Grant was key. But Twain comes pretty late in the process. Twain, and this is no surprise to anybody who likes Mark Twain, Twain's specialty is selling the book. He's really good at marketing it, getting people interested in it. Johnson was the guy who really helped Grant realize how good of a writer he could be. And Grant was very self-conscious. I mean, Americans already knew his prose, not only from his time as president, but his time as a general. He would write, his official statements and messages as general would be reprinted in newspapers, and people everywhere would read them and sort of respond to them very positively. But Grant still, for whatever reason, didn't really think of himself as a writer. And so when people would say, hey, you should write a book, he would decline. Well, once he needed the money, he finally agreed to write some magazine stories for this magazine called the Century Magazine, where Johnson was an editor. And so Grant writes a first draft of the battle about Shiloh, and he sends it in to Johnson. And Johnson reads it and shares it at the office. And I still remember the phrase Johnson said. He said that it suffered from the blight of the official report. It was just all statistics, all summary, all very impersonal, all very 30,000 feet. And somebody could have written that from the official statistics that by that point had been published about the Civil War. There was no Grant in Grant's story. And so Johnson went to meet with Grant. This was at Grant's had a summer home, which he was there. He's out of money, but he realized that he and his family could live so much more cheaply in their summer home than they could in New York City, that they had sort of retreated there, trying to keep their expenses down and give Grant space to do this writing. So Johnson brings a draft and sits down with Grant, and we can really see these scenes so vividly because Johnson himself wrote a great memoir about it after the fact. And so Johnson sits down and just starts asking Grant questions like, well, you were at Shiloh. What happened? Then what happened next? Yeah, I know you wrote about how many soldiers you had on that front, but what was your thinking there? And Grant just starts talking and talking very personally, talking very humanly. He tells the story, which is, I think, probably the best story in Grant's memoirs, where he finds a church that's been converted into a makeshift hospital, and it's raining. It's at night in the middle of the battle, and Grant goes in to try to stay out of the rain. But he hears the sounds of soldiers, having amputations done to them and their screams, and the fact that Grant understands that, he is in some way responsible for the what's happening in that makeshift hospital is so bad to him that Grant just decides, you know what, I'd rather stay outside in the silence and in the rain. And he spends the night out there because it's too emotionally harrowing for him to be inside. That story isn't in the first draft. That's not in the one that has the blight of the official report. But Johnson, the editor, talks to Grant, pulls those stories out, and Johnson had a newspaper in his lap, and he just sort of, very quietly sort of sketches, oh, Grant's saying this, oh, Grant's saying that. He doesn't want to make a big deal out of it and make Grant too self-conscious, because Grant's self-consciousness is kind of what's making that first draft so rough in the first place. And so after they did that for a while, Johnson said, this is the story. This is everything that you've told me here that I've taken these skeletal notes about. This has to be in that draft. And if it's in there, that will capture the personal side. That's what readers will want to know. And he said that Grant, it just clicked for him. That once he said that, Grant immediately understood what he needed to do. And the next draft came much more quickly and had all those sort of personal moments in there in that personal perspective. And just since we've talked a little bit about method here, I read that in Johnson's memoir, and I was like, that's a great story. I hope it's true. I better go check. And so the Library of Congress has the different drafts of Grant's memoirs there. So I read the first draft that he wrote for the magazine one. Definitely it feels like an official report. And I read the second draft. And in that second draft, the stories that Johnson had said Grant added, they show up in that second draft. And you can even see in Grant's handwriting that he's sort of learning to be a better writer, that there are fewer times where he crosses things out or where he kind of pauses with his pen. He's getting more confident, more fluid, and more personal. And it was really an editor that helped him kind of discover that in himself. And, that's not that different than having a good ghostwriter. It still requires Grant being involved and active and working hard. But once he got a little bit of help, that helped him be able to tell this amazing story, which is still just a masterpiece of military history.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I especially appreciate that last vignette you shared about checking it in the archives, and little, word to any of the PhD students listening to this. This is why archival research is so important, because it illuminates so much of the process and not just the final outcomes of whatever particular policy or individual or product you're looking at. So, all right, cool. Craig, now pivoting, I suppose, in a unhappy way towards the other end of the ghostwriting spectrum, there's, where we're going with this, there's John F. Kennedy, JFK, who doesn't get as flattering of a treatment in your book, and seems to have had. Well, it's well known that Ted Sorensen was a great writer, but there seems to have been a more habitual use of ghostwriting by Kennedy in ways I could tell you weren't as approving of. And I'm just going to read a brief excerpt from your introduction here. Because you start the book with Kennedy. The most interesting thing about Kennedy as an author isn't that he got help with Profiles in Courage, but that he worked so hard to cover up that help, that he was desperate to impress literary audiences at the National Book Awards and anywhere else. So tell us more about what you learned about Kennedy over the course of doing this book, and maybe if I'm being a little unfair by saying you have a relatively negative assessment overall, so I'll let you put it in your words, but what your assessment is.
No, I don't think you're being unfair at all about my assessment of him. We already talked a little bit about ghostwriting, that ghostwriting is a wonderful tool for politicians to have, and especially if they're actively involved, it can be, it's an efficient way to get stuff done and to get stuff done at the highest level, because different people have different skills. And I don't necessarily think that being a great writer is the most important or the only skill that a great president needs to have. Kennedy took things differently, though. He took things a step further. George Washington didn't really care if he got credit for the farewell address, but he certainly wasn't trying to win literary awards for it. And that's where Kennedy was different. And you can see this not just in Profiles in Courage. You can see this in Kennedy's first book, While England Slept, where he also got a lot of help. But for Kennedy, and really for his entire family, because his father was very involved in this as well, books were an important kind of credentialing. Like, if you had a book, it made you seem serious, it made you seem distinguished, it made you seem established, especially if you were a young and very good-looking politician, which of course Kennedy was. Sorensen has talked really interestingly that that the magazine articles, the book chapters, and the books were sort of a counterweight to the TV appearances and the glossy magazine covers, and they sort of gave Kennedy the best of both worlds. Here's somebody who's glamorous and also somebody who's intellectual and serious. Again, I can go along with that, honestly, because Kennedy, did surround himself with people like Sorensen and Schlesinger and other intellectuals. But Kennedy took things a step further. And this is the stuff that really surprised me in my research. And it's another example of how when you really zoom in on this question of presidents and their books, you see a personal side of them. Because Kennedy was obsessed with literary fame. Even, Profiles in Courage, the most of the work is done by Sorensen while Kennedy is recovering from a really difficult back surgery, 2 back surgeries, actually. So Kennedy just doesn't have the physical capability to work on the book, although there's also not much evidence from the times when Kennedy was healthy of him having the kind of personality where he would sit down and really work hard on a piece of prose. That's just not what he wanted to do. But once the book was done, Kennedy just became so actively involved, even though he was a senator who'd missed a lot of time and was now back in Washington and had so many things to do. But, from the marketing stage onward, Kennedy cared about every last little detail. He went to the publisher and said, I really think we need a bigger author photo on this book. He went to the publisher and said, let's make sure to use the review that the New York Times gave my first book. And even though it had been 15 years and Kennedy was actually out of the country, this is another one of those archival examples. I knew from the letter that Kennedy was outside of the country, so there was no way he could, dig up the New York Times issue from 17 years ago at that point. So he just had it memorized, the whole sentence about what the New York Times had said about his book. Even once the book came out, and he's traveling, he writes his editor letters and say, hey, I was in the Washington airport and I didn't really see enough copies of my book. Can we fix that? Kennedy just really, really wanted to be seen as a writer, even if he wasn't willing to do the work of being a writer. And I don't know if it's just literary fame mattered to him more than any other fame. I don't know if it's because he was around so many writers and wanted to be seen as their equal. I'm not sure what exactly it was, but the biggest evidence I found of this centered on the Pulitzer Prize. Kennedy ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize for the book. And that to me is, the step too far. You can have a good book that's been ghostwritten and focus on yourself as the named author and not, he didn't need to say, hey, thanks Ted Sorensen in every discussion. But once you get a Pulitzer Prize for a book that you yourself didn't have much to do with, that becomes less a question of authorship and more a question of morals, I think. And it's not just that Kennedy got the Pulitzer Prize because other people thought this was a fantastic book. I found documents at the Kennedy Library that shows that Kennedy was personally campaigning behind the scenes, drafting family friends who were really influential in New York journalism circles and using them to influence it and get his book the award. There are letters where people on the committee that year for the Pulitzer Prizes was like, nobody is talking about this Kennedy book. Can you give us some reasons why this is even worth considering? And then Kennedy's allies, who Kennedy and his father had sort of put up to this, said, here's the reasons. Here's why this book deserves the award. Once the book won the award, that's when the ghostwriting sort of first became a scandal. And you can even see in Kennedy's response to the scandal the kind of moral questions that I mentioned earlier. When Kennedy was finalizing the book, he wrote the introduction. It's really the one part of the book, a couple pages that we can be sure that he wrote in his handwriting. And in the first draft of the introduction, he didn't even mention Ted Sorensen. He also didn't mention his wife, Jackie. And so Sorensen is reading this, and it's like, he gives him Kennedy 4 things to change. One of them is, mention this professor. One of them is let's mention Jackie. And the last thing, Sorensen just puts his initials, TCS ? And I mean, if you want to read into something, you can read a lot into that, the two men's relationship there, that Sorensen is just kind of saying, what about all the work I did? I wrote this book. You're not even going to mention me? And so Kennedy adds one sentence to the introduction that just says, thanks to Ted Sorensen for preparing the materials on which this book is based. Very lawyerly kind of framing. Well, once the scandal blew up, once the book won the Pulitzer Prize and journalists started gossiping and saying, what's actually going on here? Kennedy did a couple things. He gave Ted Sorensen a fabulous sum of money, well over $1 million in today's terms, which helped keep Ted Sorensen quiet. But he also started citing that line from the introduction. So Kennedy would say, well, sure, Ted helped me a little bit. I mean, I mentioned it in the introduction. It's not like I'm trying to hide anything here. But if you go back to the archive, you see that the only reason he's mentioned it in the introduction is because Sorensen was working so hard on the book that he had to remind Kennedy, hey, you forgot to mention me and your wife in the introduction. But, for Kennedy, what mattered was literary fame. And then, once he got that Pulitzer, which he wanted, it actually caused him problems. That's when it really became the potential for a scandal that would impact his presidential run. If he had never tried to get the Pulitzer Prize, he could have just been content with having a huge best-selling book that burnished his reputation. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted more.
Yeah, very, very revealing. So then, of course, in some interesting contrast, I also really enjoyed your chapter on Harry Truman. And again, I'm a longtime fan of Truman and did part of my dissertation, first book on him. So I've spent quite a bit of time at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, a wonderful place where even the very fact of being there, you get a sense for the man and his roots. And again, a fascinating background where he leaves the White House, nearly penniless. No pension beyond just his, very small check from his military service in World War I. And I'm reading from page 245 in your book here. As you point out, ex-presidents had plenty of ways to make a buck: endorsement deals, consulting fees, marketing stunts. But Truman rejected all of them. He hated the thought of doing something that would exploit or demean the executive branch. And that standard applied to ex-presidents as well. I'd rather starve, he said. Very, typically blunt Truman. But he is willing, of course, to write a book. And that partly stems from, even though he was, our last president not to have gone to college, he was a lifelong reader, a very devoted student of history in particular, which I think explains a lot of his early Cold War statecraft. And then it turns into the process of crafting the book turns into quite a fiasco, as you point out. I love the little trivia that he initially approaches a very young Dick Neustadt to ghostwrite it. Neustadt, of course, later becomes the great scholar at Harvard, a Kennedy advisor, and for those of us interested in history and policy, the co-author with Ernie May of Thinking in Time. So I had to put that little plug in there. But Neustadt turns Truman down, says, "No, I want to go do my own stuff." And so then it's just a series of debacles, the process of Truman putting together these memoir. And yet Truman is deeply involved throughout. And you make a case that the final product, although a little clunky and maybe too long, is still a pretty good piece of work. So and I'm giving away some of the main bottom lines here, but tell us a little bit more about what you discovered in the course of writing the Truman section.
Yeah, I mean, Truman is definitely a president who he's a hard guy not to like, and he's a hard guy not to make likable when you're writing about him. But I came away with such respect and appreciation for his very sincere, conviction that history was important and that history had shaped him and that he owed something to history. And every president is going to say, I owe something to history. And that's generally just going to be their cover to write a book that sort of defends themselves and sort of gives the version of themselves they want history to consider to history. But I really think that Truman had a deeper, almost disciplinary commitment to history. And it started with him as a reader. And, some of the little moments I try to draw out in the book are the sorts of ways that readers got books. One way, if you live sort of out away from the big cities, which of course was most Americans for much of American history, was that you would have traveling salesmen show up with books. And so a really important book for Harry Truman when he was 10 years old was a volume of 4 histories with chapters in them. One of the chapters was actually written by a young Teddy Roosevelt that a traveling salesman had brought to the house, and Harry Truman's mom had bought for him, and Truman studied that book. These kinds of traveling booksellers are everywhere in American history. Grant's memoirs that we talked about were partly sold through traveling booksellers. And so those kinds of little connections remind you that, before Harry Truman was Harry Truman, he was somebody who just loved history and sort of got his first exposure to these ideas through traveling booksellers and history like anybody else. But that commitment, that love of history never really left Truman. And so when he said, I owe this book to history, he meant it. He needed the money, of course. He needed something to do as well. And his book was really the first example of kind of a blockbuster presidential memoir, the kind of book that presidents are still writing today, that Reagan wrote, that Clinton wrote, that Obama is working on right now. And Truman got a lot of money for it. If you adjust his advance by inflation, it was the equivalent of $7 or $8 million today. He didn't make a lot of money, though, because of those debacles, but also because he was so committed to producing a serious book and a serious archive that went with it. So Truman paid for all this out of his own pocket. He had an office. He had multiple ghostwriters, multiple researchers, multiple advisors, and they really worked hard on this book. They produced millions of words of prose, which was far more than they could put in the actual book. And the prose isn't always the best prose. There are even times where Truman will insert primary documents into the book in a way that really keeps it from being a readable narrative, even though you can understand that, again, that love of history, it's really important for him to kind of have the primary documents to show his side of things. But there are still moments in the book that are really, really good, despite this sort of crazy behind-the-scenes process where he's got, one ghostwriter comes along and says, hey, I'm going to help you on it. I just need to spend some time by myself going through the papers. Then this person leaves a few months later and writes a dissertation based on the material, the classified material in those papers. So Truman just unfortunately he was a magnet for bad operators in terms of this book. But he worked hard on it. And one of the things that I really think is incredible that he did is he brought in people who had served in his administration and would have them be interviewed by his ghostwriters. And Truman would sit in the room. And so somebody would say something, Truman would jump in, the advisor would jump in, and all of a sudden they were having a discussion while a stenographer is sitting in the corner of the room, taking everything down verbatim. And as I say in my chapter, when you see this isn't history being made. This is history. This is the thing itself. And so although Truman's final book was a little unwieldy, first of all, it was an enormously popular book at the time. It was one of the 10 best-selling nonfiction books of the year that year. People everywhere loved it, and especially because the presidency had changed so much that with FDR and Truman and the atomic age, being president and being an American in the world was so different at that point that Americans really loved this book because it was that kind of personal look at those dynamics and sort of let you understand how one person was sort of feeling the weight of the changing geopolitical scale. So it was a popular book too. But then the fact that Truman did all this work, there's the book, but there's more than 40,000 pages from the making of the book that are still at the Truman Library that I looked at, that David McCullough looked at a while ago when he worked on his book, that any biographer can look at. And so in a sense, I think, even though Truman, this lover of history, couldn't produce a great historical book himself, he produced something just as valuable, which is a great historical archive. There are letters from Truman's childhood that the only surviving copies are the copies that were made for the memoirs. There are so many examples like that where because he was so thorough, because he was so factual, because he cared so much about getting things right, he helped produce and preserve so many documents that anybody who writes about Truman today is indebted not just to Truman for being the historical figure he was, but is indebted to Truman as a historical author because he preserved all this stuff.
Yeah, and that ties into another theme I was going to draw out with Truman as well, which is and you touch on this in your book, how Truman leaves office as one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. You know, the economy's a mess. There's been scandal, but especially the Korean War is this quagmire, and he writes, you know, this overall pretty good memoir, which, as you point out, sells quite well. But it's still, the memoir itself doesn't do much to rehabilitate his reputation. It's not until, you know, I think initially about 20 years later, as the Cold War is taking shape more, and, you know, late 60s, early 70s, people now start looking back saying, hey, Truman actually got some things right. I do think he's helped by the publication of Dean Acheson's memoir in '69, President of the Creation, which he dedicates to Truman, the captain with a mighty heart. I just love that phrase. But then it really takes off, as you said, with McCullough's book in the late '80s or early '90s. So, and Truman is now, I think, rightly regarded as certainly among, you know, our near great, if not great presidents.
Yeah, and it's an example that writing one of these books is not going to save your historical reputation or really shape it. That's going to be up to people like you and me and a lot of the listeners who go to the archives and make those evaluations themselves. Even Grant's book, which we just talked about how wonderful it is, and, you know, the whole focus of the book is not Grant's presidency, it's Grant's military reputation and the decisions he made. But it couldn't save it. You know, for the next 100 years, Southern historians were just basically trying to push the narrative of Grant the Butcher versus Lee the Gentleman. So if you write a book as a president and you're hoping that this book is going to shape your reputation, that's a false hope. That's never going to happen. If Ulysses S. Grant couldn't write a book good enough to save his reputation, I don't think any other White House occupant has a chance either. I think what they should do instead is write a more personal book. And whether it's, you know, there are moments in Truman's book that are personal, or even somebody like Calvin Coolidge, another one of the big surprises in my book in terms of what a wonderful writer he was. And his autobiography is like a sixth as long as Grant's. It's a very slim little book. There's not much policy in it. I mean, partly because he finished it before the Depression started, and so he didn't feel the need to justify and defend his administration. But it's just a book that sort of says, this is what it felt like to be president. This is what the human side of being in the White House was. I think that's a better approach. I think presidents would be better served, and certainly readers would be better served, if presidents stopped trying to settle arguments and settle scores and just said, you know, this is what my experience in the White House was like for me.
Yeah. Let me, Craig, close with one more question. And this is going to be a pretty broad question about two presidents who happened in different ways be Truman's successors, Eisenhower and Nixon. Of course, you know, initially Eisenhower's president and Nixon as his vice president, and then Nixon later becomes president in his own right. Two presidents who are certainly giants in the field of American foreign policy and statecraft. And so that's special interest to a lot of our listeners. Two presidents who, you know, write pretty lengthy memoirs and who have, you know, very different trajectories in office. You don't give us much time to either of them in your book, and I don't say that by criticism at all. I know no one can include everything, but tell us a little bit more. Anything you learned about Eisenhower and Truman as authors over the course of your research? Maybe stuff you wish you could have included but didn't in the book.
Well, one of the my favorite Nixon stories was about the genesis of six crises, and I slipped this into the Kennedy chapter, which is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, they've just had the election. Kennedy calls Nixon in to sort of talk through the issues and what's happened and what the right, you know, what are Republicans going to be willing to go along with? What's the status on that side of the aisle? And Nixon wrote about this a couple different times in his career and talked about, you know, how Kennedy seemed so deflated. He could already see that the job of being in the White House was wearing on him, and they're getting ready to leave. And Nixon sort of says, you know, I'm trying to decide what I need to do next. Now that the election's over, I might write a book. And Kennedy just perked up again, because, you know, there's nothing Kennedy liked more than talking about literary life, even if he didn't quite live it himself. And Kennedy sort of said, you know, I really think you should write a book, because if you're a politician who's written a book, that can really serve you well. And so that comment, among other things, inspired Nixon to write Six Crises, which was a really important book for his political rehabilitation and his political career. And Nixon knew that, and his team knew that. I wasn't really able to get too much into Six Crises in my book, but they were very strategic about purchasing copies at specific California bookstores to try to get it on the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times bestseller list. It was really something where they thought, you know, this book, but also the news around this book can really be a way to sort of help Nixon rehabilitate his reputation and start his next act in life. That book then goes on to influence Reagan, I think, because when Reagan is working on his book, Where's the Rest of Me? Six Crises has just come out, and it's a reminder, along with Profiles in Courage and Goldwater's book, to Reagan that, a book that's well written and that balances the personal with the political can really make a difference for an ambitious candidate, and Reagan was influenced by that as well. Eisenhower's probably even more interesting. I really regretted that I couldn't put more Eisenhower in there, because I spent a few days at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, which is a great facility too. And I have a lot of respect for Eisenhower as a writer. Crusade in Europe is if there's any book that can compete with Grant's for the best military book written by an American president, it would be that book by Eisenhower. And he was, he had a lot of help. He had researchers. He had people who would take his dictations, but it's still very much his book that he wrote, and he wrote it very quickly, and it was a big seller. And again, they're really interesting documents where the people who worked with Eisenhower saw that book as an important part of positioning him to run for president and reminding Americans what they liked about Eisenhower so much. But Eisenhower was just more bookish, I think, than people give him credit for. What I'm working on right now is this anthology, again with Simon Schuster, called Best Presidential Writing. And, Eisenhower's got more words in there than Kennedy. And I had to cut some Eisenhower stuff I didn't want to cut, because he had really important speeches, about the military-industrial complex and other issues. But he also had really fun little kind of bookish asides you wouldn't expect. I still remember finding this essay that, as far as I could find, has never been published, but that Eisenhower worked on, and it was at the library, and it's just about writing memoirs. And so after Eisenhower's presidential memoirs had come out, and they're not perfect books, they have some of the same flaws that Truman's had, but they're still important, and Americans still really liked them at the time. But after that book came out, Eisenhower's publisher said, well, you've written a memoir. Do you have any thoughts about the writing of a memoir and what politicians should do? And Eisenhower had a lot of thoughts. And it's a really wonderful essay that I'm going to publish a big excerpt from in this anthology, because he starts by talking about Grant's book. And you can really feel that there's not just a political tradition of presidents, but a literary tradition where Eisenhower says, this is why Grant wrote the way he did. This is the value of what Grant wrote. And this is how I tried to write that same way, that I tried to sort of say, this is why I did these things. This is what only I knew at the time. And this is how it informed my decisions. And so Eisenhower does a really credible job as a literary critic and sort of talking about the genre of memoir and how it's a little unfair to criticize them because their literary style might not be quite what you want, because the information and the accuracy is what matters the most. And he adds anecdotes about, a soldier coming up to him and saying, this one battle you describe in Crusade in Europe, I think you were off by about 3 tanks there. And Eisenhower is just, mortified that he got that one detail slightly wrong. But it's a fun essay, and it just shows that, even presidents that you might not expect, like Coolidge or Eisenhower, they had a literary side, and they were readers and they were writers, and both of those skill sets served them well as they were presidents.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to that new anthology you're working on too. So anyway, all right. Well, Craig Furman, thanks again so much for joining us for this. And all our listeners highly encourage you to buy and read the book, Author in Chief. So thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.